Well, it's certainly been an interesting week for Bungie and Sony, mostly because we got the information coming out that they were missing their projections for revenue by 45%. We then saw 8% or so, over 100 people being laid off within Bungie, and a whole lot of information just flooding out there online that's even brought into question Sony's decision to buy Bungie at all. And we got a bit more information here to close out the week, and I kind of wanted to discuss it somewhat here today. So if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe if you're new here to the Spawnwave Plus channel. So first off, let's head over here. This is from Forbes and Paul Tassi, who has really been following this very closely, and it makes sense because he's a big fan of just Destiny 2 in general. Seems to play it quite a bit, really into the lore, the game itself, following all these updates. And now everyone's kind of looking forward to next year with the final shape. That's going to be their big expansion that, according to Jason Schreier in his report, was pushed roughly 4 months from February into June. Kind of leaves a large gap then from the season that's starting, I believe, this month. I mean, it's like 7 months or so until their big expansion here. So it'll be interesting to see how Bungie is able to kind of navigate that, maybe come up with something in the meantime, halfway through that 7-month period, just to kind of keep things fresh a bit. But of course, people have been curious about kind of the inner workings of Bungie and how all this happened in the first place. And we got, again, a bit more information here as Paul Tassi has looked into this. I'd recommend, if you're curious about all this stuff, how it's unfolding, check him out on Twitter, or I guess I think you can follow him on Forbes as well. But some of the bullet points here include management said other levers were looked at to avoid layoffs. We did get an update here, though, as one of the things was, employees asked if one lever was executive compensation, as in bonuses or salaries, that sort of thing, because we know what the thing that's always brought up is that Satoru Iwata famously cut his own salary and other executives around him at the time when Nintendo was going through it, I'd say, with something like the Wii U to make sure that they did not have to have mass layoffs or anything there. So you kind of look around and go, why can't other companies do this? But in an update, it says post-publication, Bungie did respond saying that CEO Pete Parsons and some other executives previously forfeited annual bonuses before the layoffs. But staff was not informed this happened until yesterday, which kind of makes you wonder if they weren't informed all of a sudden that, well, they saw some of the discussion around their own compensation not being affected. And like, let's throw that out there and we'll work this out in the books later. Maybe it's still, though, it's pretty clear Bungie has some pretty significant issues. However, this one was, this bullet point here I think is pretty important because many people have been wondering if this is Sony's fault, if this is Bungie's fault, like where does most of the blame fall? And we talked about this in Direct Xbox, which that is up today on the Spawncast network. You can also patreon.com/Spawncast. And we spent actually a fair amount of time on this entire situation because Destiny 2 is a big-time game on Xbox, and obviously the history with Bungie and Microsoft, it goes back a long ways, right? So it was interesting to see Bungie in this current situation. But they say internally, really no one is blaming Sony for this, even management. Some employees were told that if the Sony buyout did not happen, that with current Destiny 2 performance, the studio itself would have been in jeopardy if they were still independent. That's actually something we brought up on Direct Xbox because this information here is actually not very new. Or at least it's some of the discussion previously, and maybe this wasn't as out in like the forefront, but it was definitely something being talked about kind of behind the scenes a bit, is that Bungie's, it's kind of brought up their burn rate. They spend a lot of money keeping Destiny 2 sort of where it was, or is now even, but definitely where it was, with the expansions that when they really hit it right, with the expansion, it comes out, it's celebrated. People get really excited with it. It's high quality stuff, even though Destiny 2 is still a pretty expensive game, all things considered, with the cosmetics, the number of expansions you buy to keep up with the lore. It is an ongoing game. It's a live service, and it's one of the most successful ones we've seen in the last, about to be decade now for this game. But it's not cheap for Bungie to do that, and there were thoughts a while ago, before Sony came in and bought them, that Bungie was probably seeking a buyer because it was more of a necessity than just something they were kind of aspiring to. Like, oh, we finally built up our equity and our value to where we can sell, and obviously the people at the top can make a bunch of money. And sure, it was more because they kind of needed like a way out. This seemed to be a real thing that they may not have been able to continue at this kind of a cadence with the development around Destiny 2, and because expectations continue to rise just in gaming in general, and development is getting more and more expensive as we go along. So we see game prices go up, for example, across the industry. We see microtransactions working their way in consistently. Basically, something would have to give. Either you spend more money on the product, or the product quality itself is reined in a bit. It's this tightrope to walk, but for Bungie, it did seem that their expenses continue to climb, and it was like, ooh, okay, the burn rate's really high. How do we work this out? Well, we can seek a buyer, and I think really looking at it, and this has been discussed multiple times, that Sony did overpay for Bungie. They did. It was like $3.5 billion. $1.2 billion of that, of course, was there for employee retention. Well, that is addressed here. That's another bullet point. Where they say that they also built a very expensive building. But as is mentioned here, the new building was a separate project, likely would not have saved jobs given the context of when that was drafted and when work started, which it takes a while to plan these things out. So they might have still been on the high of like the previous really successful expansion when they put things into motion with the financing around that, gathering, of course, all the materials, the contractors, etc., to build all of that out, getting the land. Sure. But then we see it, of course, come to fruition as we are getting closer to them maybe announcing job layoffs, which not great optics, but with the flow of things behind the scenes, it takes a while to get a lot of this stuff done. And at times you see something like this happen. But the $1.2 billion in employee retention from Sony was spent long ago, often on buying out employees' Bungie shares, which then went to Sony. So there's nothing left in that pot to avoid layoffs, which wasn't what it was meant for this late in the transition. As mentioned, it was more or less to keep people there after the acquisition happened in more of the immediate tense, right? Not like, oh, a year from now, 2 years from now, this money will be there to avoid layoffs. Remember, Sony also bought in to Bungie to acquire them so that they could have kind of the expertise that was gained over the process of launching and maintaining Destiny and then Destiny 2 for their own live service projects, which hasn't really panned out so far. We've heard more about these live service games being canceled or put on ice, as has been described with The Last of Us, as opposed to them coming out and doing anything, being successful, even failing. Okay, you can learn from that. None of that's... We're seeing Deviation have their funding cut. We're seeing Naughty Dog having Bungie tell them to take it back, put it on ice, figure something else out. This isn't going to work. It is hard for me to believe that Naughty Dog created something so bad that it had to go back, or they created something that wasn't able to pull in the kind of revenue in the long term that Destiny 2 has been able to. However, I do still see people mention that Destiny 2, not the friendliest to new players, and that is something that Bungie will have to figure out for onboarding new players if they're going to continue with Destiny 2 for the next couple of years. Or are they going to go to something like Destiny 3? Because I do have questions around Marathon. I don't really know if Marathon is going to be their big solve, mostly because it doesn't have the namesake that Destiny has built up, right? I mean, Marathon, there are many people right now who were not alive when Marathon was out, way back when. But two, I don't know if it's going to have the same effect as an extraction shooter as opposed to Destiny or Destiny 2, which is more of like a, like open world, but open instance, kind of looter shooter style game. I guess if it does work out, it would be massive for them, but the pressure is enormous for Marathon, which is also now pushed to 2025. And if I'm Sony currently, I might be looking at this wondering, hold on, is Bungie actually like an expert at live service stuff? Because they have Destiny 2, which has worked out really well for them up until where, well, we see here where it became very expensive to maintain, but they launched it successfully. It's been around for a while. It's not easy to keep a live service game running at all, but they've kept it going, and they've really fostered this community that really got behind them. They were able to even like buy their independence and get away from Activision and then still retain the IP. So they've done some pretty impressive stuff just in the gaming landscape, but it just seemed like they kind of ran out of steam with this and they had to seek a buyer, and they found Sony, who was also looking for expertise with live service. That kind of lined up at that here and now at the time with Destiny 2, but that's like kind of it for Bungie. I mean, they had Destiny 1, but Destiny 2 was clearly their most successful thing, but could they do it again? Can they replicate it with something that's not Destiny? That's kind of the question. So I don't know. If I'm Sony, I'm realizing that their management at Bungie is not good, and that's what a lot of this seems to be coming back to. So if they're having a hard enough time managing their own studio, their own company, who is acting independent right now from Sony, can we trust them to manage and figure out if these live service games that aren't Destiny should come out or not? That's a big question. So I feel like I was Naughty Dog. I'd go back to Sony and say, hey, why don't we just try it? Let's see what happens with this thing, because I am genuinely curious to see what they had come up with, and if it was a game quality issue or if it was a game monetization issue. But let me know what you guys think about this down below. So really, when it comes to Sony and Bungie, who's more responsible? It's Bungie and their management. However, Sony, hey, when you go to the top, right, that's usually who has to figure things out, and that is Sony right now. Of course, who owns Bungie. So I'm curious if in the long run, the more macro picture, if Sony has maybe some second thoughts about this acquisition of Bungie. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.